Today, I will be focusing on autism spectrum disorders. Autism spectrum disorders is one out of 13 categories of the Individuals with Disabilities Act. The Individuals with Disabilities Act is a piece of federal legislation that guarantees students with disabilities a free and appropriate public education that meets their individual needs. So, what is autism? According to IDEA 2004, autism is a developmental disability that severely affects verbal communication, nonverbal communication, social interaction, and usually onsets by age 3, and it adversely affects their educational performance. When looking at statistics, autism is the fastest growing developmental disability. The nationwide prevalence rate is 1 out of 68, and New Jersey's prevalence rate is 1 out of 41. Given an extremely high prevalence rate in the state of New Jersey, it is that much more important that counselors and teachers understand how to accommodate students with autism. When looking at diversity, autism occurs in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. It is 4.5 times more likely in boys than in girls. In New Jersey, 1 out of 29 boys are diagnosed with autism. When looking at different racial groups, African Americans, the Latinx community, and those of Asian descent were found to be identified later in life. Mandel et al. 2007 found that African Americans were first diagnosed with ADHD, conduct disorder, and oppositional defiance disorder. Other factors that contributed to a later identification were educational level, finances, and a language barrier. So there are a number of signs and symptoms for autism. When looking at babies, it is often suspected that children have autism if you do not if they have limited or no eye contact by 6 months, if there isn't any babbling by 12 months, or if they're not using any kind of gesture to communicate, such as pointing. There are a number of symptoms at any age, which include avoiding eye contact, difficulty understanding emotions, and repeating words or phrases, which is also known as echolalia. So although symptoms can vary greatly across the spectrum, there are 3 main categories where symptoms usually lie, which is social interaction, communication deficits, and repetitive behavior. When looking at the image, you can see that these 3 are the 3 main areas that autism affects. So social deficits, language impairment, and repetitive behavior. Across the spectrum, there are other areas that are also influenced. So students with autism may experience sleep deficits, mood, anxiety, hyperactivity and attention difficulty, seizures, which is common in many students with severe autism, and gastrointestinal issues. There are also a number of related disorders such as OCD, ADHD, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and immune dysfunction. So let's talk about the spectrum. As you can see, the spectrum is broken up into 3 main categories. The first is high functioning autism. So you will see these students in your classes, and there are certain ways that you can accommodate them. Students with high functioning autism have social deficits but do not have cognitive deficits. Therefore, these students often have difficulty with attention because they focus on obsessive interests. Types of obsessive interests include focusing on trains, sciences, videotapes, things like that. So oftentimes, giving the student a break to allow them to focus on these interests or giving them preferential seating can help them pay attention. When looking at level 2, which is more moderate autism, these students have social and cognitive deficits. So an individual aid may be an appropriate modification for these students so that they can keep them on track and increase social interaction. They may also need activities of daily living, such as toothbrushing and hand washing and focusing on money and other topics that we use in our daily lives. Students with severe autism are often placed in private settings or day programs because the district and parents agree that the public school is not the most appropriate setting for these students. Um, Students with severe autism usually are nonverbal, may not be toileted, and may have aggressive behavior. So students with high functioning, there are a number of accommodations that can help students with high functioning autism. First, because students with autism have difficulty with routine, a schedule on their desk may be helpful to help with transition. A reinforcement or reward system if students have difficulty with behavior. So allowing them to use an iPad or reading a book after they complete their task may be very reinforcing for these students. Giving them preferential seating to decrease distractions. So seating them away from a air conditioner or bright lights because they do get easily distracted and are very sensitive to sensory stimuli. Finally, giving the students break during the day to avoid a sensory overload because these students take in all textures, smells, and hearing and can become very anxious and overwhelmed. So there are a number of accommodations and modifications that we can use for students that have moderate autism. So a picture schedule detailing their daily activities to assist with transitions. Now these students, because they have cognitive deficits, may need that visual cue to help them navigate their schedule. They may also benefit from an individual aid to keep them on track with their work and to help them interact with their peers. A modified classroom assignments that are developmentally appropriate for the student. So for example, if a student is on a 5th grade level or in 5th grade but reading at a 1st grade level, it would be appropriate for the teacher to modify the classwork so that it meets their reading level at a 1st grade level. A reinforcement or reward system to decrease behavioral outbursts. And finally, a modified schedule that includes activities of daily living, like I said, such as toothbrushing, hand washing, how to cross the street safely, activities like that they will use in their daily lives. So when looking at these two different schedules, you can see that there are accommodations. When looking at the schedule over here, this schedule is most appropriate for a student with high functioning autism. Because these students do not have cognitive deficits, they will be able to follow the written language and the different steps. By having these different steps, they can check them off and know what they need to do next. For students that have cognitive deficits, this visual cue will help them follow the schedule properly. Oftentimes, they may need the aid or a fellow peer to help them complete their morning routine, but the visual cue allows them to be more independent. So there are a number of related services for students with autism, and these related services will be in their IEP. So a lot of students may receive speech and language pathology 2 to 3 times a week. Speech pathologists work with students with autism in both individual and group sessions, and they may work on receptive language, such as WH questions, so why and how questions, because these questions are particularly difficult for these students. They may also work on pragmatics and social skills, so turn taking, how to enter and exit a conversation, and eye contact. And many students also may experience articulation issues, so they'll work on that as well. Another related service that may be in students with autism IEP is occupational therapy. Because students are so sensory to stimuli, occupational therapists will introduce different textures, smells, hearing, and tastes that may be in the school environment so students can decrease their sensitivity and focus on what they need to in school. The occupational therapist may also use joint compressions and weighted vests to decrease sensory stimuli. And finally, another related service may be applied behavior analysis therapy. So this is a behavior modification system, and it's usually to extinguish or decrease behavior. It also includes prompting such as physical prompts, verbal prompts, gestural prompts. Oftentimes, ABA therapy may not be appropriate for those that are higher on the spectrum. It is often used with students that are lower on the spectrum. So what can counselors do to help students with autism? First, they can organize a lunch bunch or a social skills group. Students need as much practice as they possibly can to exit and enter a conversation, to use eye contact, to understand the proper personal space, and other kinds of social skills. Counselors can also conduct one-on-one counseling sessions with students with high-functioning autism to alleviate anxiety, decrease obsessive interest, and practice emotion regulation. Counselors can also work with students' families to ensure that routine is being kept at home. They can also check in with parents and the students' siblings to make sure that there's structure and to ensure that the students are receiving the proper accommodations at school. Counselors should also check in with students and teachers to ensure that the students are not being bullied. The incidence of bullying is extremely high among the autism population. And finally, counselors can start a peer modeling program to increase social interaction and the amount of time that students with autism are interacting with their non-disabled peers. If you have any questions about autism, please write them in the discussion board and I would be happy to answer them as best as I can.